everyone, this is Dia Bondi, and this is Lead with Who You Are. And on this show, we explore and discover what it truly means to lead with who you are, and we're doing it with people who embody just that and can show us how to do it too. In this episode, we're talking with Maria Giudice, four-time author and design leader, about change making. And oh, this one is good. Maria and I talk about how leaders can design for change and, really importantly, how they can communicate through it in a way that enrolls supporters to help amplify and accelerate that change. Maria lists the top mistakes leaders make when navigating change and how we can keep hope alive when change is hard. Listen in. Hey, just a quick reminder. You can subscribe to this show on your podcast platform of choice. We're live nearly everywhere, and you can always listen to the show at diabondi.com. If there's a leader or innovator in your life who is at their shiniest when they lead with who they truly are, please share the show with them and rate, subscribe, and leave us a review. It makes a huge difference in the reach that the show has when you let everyone else know what you love about the show. Thanks so much. For 3 decades, creative teams and business leaders have sought the provocative vision and mentorship of Maria Giudice. After founding the pioneering experience design firm Hot Studio and leading global teams at Facebook and Autodesk, Maria's mission today is to build the next generation of creative leaders. Through one-on-one coaching, group coaching, and team-building workshops, Maria unlocks the potential hidden in every executive and the people they lead. A popular speaker at design and business conferences, Maria is also the author of 4 design books, including Rise of the DEO, Leadership by Design, and most recently, Changemakers, How Leaders Can Design Change in an Insanely Complex World. Hello, Maria. Maria, I'm so glad to hear you and to see you. Hello.
I'm happy to see you too. I'm sending a lot of love your way.
Thank you so much. So I'm having you, we already recorded and grabbed your introduction. So we'll start by saying we're having you on the show today because you're super punk rock, number one. And number two, because you are a design force with such a strong perspective on the power of design and really specifically how leaders can use it to create the change they want to lead themselves. So you even wrote a book about it, and I'll say the title again, which is Changemakers, How Leaders Can Design Change in an Insanely Complex World. And to be clear, it is available now. Am I right?
It will be available in early January.
Great. So it'll be available. It should be available now by the time we release this. So there it is.
Probably.
There.
Yes.
So we already introduced you formally, like I mentioned, but I want to ask you, I'm going to start with a question, which is today, how might you answer the question, who are you?
Oh, that is a really good coaching question. Who am I right now? I always like to say I'm a work in progress. I really am. Like when I think about my life and I think about, I had a dream. I had a pretty clear path when I was younger. Thankfully, that's such a gift to have that. But what excites me is I just am driven by curiosity and I'm driven by passion. And I just feel like I'm on a sort of a gradation. And I really do think of myself as a work in progress, and I can always improve and I can always learn. And if I lean into my curiosity, it'll take me to places that I'm not really aware of now, but I have to trust the universe that it's going to be the right place.
I mean, I asked you the question about, how would you answer that today? Recognizing that how we aren't one who forever, things change and, not that we chameleon, but there's things that evolve and what matters to us then doesn't matter to us now. But, as you look at the trajectory of your career and life and impact, would you say that you've always had that perspective or recognition that you're a work in progress, or did you have a more fixed sense of yourself at one point?
I totally had a fixed sense of myself. I mean, I think, ever since I could remember, I was a hyperachiever. Okay, we can kind of decode that, right? But I always felt like I had a game plan and I cared very much about I wouldn't say career ladders, but a ladder. Like I'm here in my life. And then, if I work really hard, I'm going to get to here in my life. And so I had that trajectory for a very long time, and also not really appreciating my success either. So I would be very successful. I would enjoy it for like a nanosecond, and then I would be very unhappy because I need to achieve the next rung. So much of my life was like that until I went through my midlife crisis in my 50s. When I asked myself the question, who am I?
And so now that your things are maybe less fixed and more fluid, do you have a stronger sense of self or a more diluted sense of self?
Oh, I have done so much work on myself since I had that moment in my 50s. Like, who am I? What's important to me? Who am I with all the packaged fear that comes with that? You're 55 years old, nobody's going to care about you, your career is over, all of those negative voices. And then I went through this, real, I would say, grief and a reflection to kind of get reborn by, here's who I am now. And that really was due to a lot of self-reflection and rethinking what growth and happiness is, and not necessarily being tied to achievement.
How does that connect to the work that you poured into Changemakers, your most recent of 4 books that you've written? Recognizing that when you sent the note out, the headline, I think, in the note was the book we've always wanted to write.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge my co-author, Christopher Ireland, and collaborator, Christopher. I just want to talk a little bit about Christopher. She is somebody who I have deeply admired throughout my professional career. So in a past life, I owned a large design studio called Hot Studio. I was the CEO and founder of that company. And Christopher, who's about 10 years older than me, was the CEO of a large design research firm called Cheskin. And so I have been like following her career. Like I look at what she's doing and it's like, oh, I want to do that in 10 years. And for the last over 10 years, we have been collaborating on projects. So my last book, Rise of the DEO, we co-authored that as well. And so this new book, Changemakers, brought the band back together, and we created that book too. So we both wanted to write this book, but it was really rooted in that moment that I was telling you. Like when I turned 55, I had been forced out of my job at Autodesk. And, you can say, whatever you want, but when you're forced out of a job, you're basically fired, right? And for a hyperachiever, highly successful person, that is, how could that be? How could somebody like me be pushed out, right? I had that like moment.
I met you right after that. I was in the audience at Invisible Talks, and it was literally like
That's
weeks
right.
after that happened. That was the first time I encountered your particular brand of badassery.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So I was given the keynote slot for Invisible Talks, where I was going to talk about all of the great achievements I had done at Autodesk as a VP of design. And that was going to be my keynote talk. But about 2 months before, I was forced out of my job. And I considered that moment a coming out party. That was the magic moment, which was, you know what? A lot of people admire me. A lot of people look at me as like they could look at my career on paper and say, oh my God, this woman is so successful. But here I am, somebody who has worked her whole career as a designer, suddenly out of a job at 55 years old. Rather than withering away, I'm going to step into the light and share my experience. I'm going to share my vulnerability about how I'm feeling. I'm going to share the fact that I have no idea where this is going to lead me. So this was like a magic moment that you were part of, which must mean the universe put us together for a reason.
I connected to your story and your energy and I didn't have a history of you in this achievement role. I had like the moment I met you, it was already something that had been completed and I was picking up from there. And so my experience of you, actually, in preparing for this podcast, I went and just watched the introduction to that talk, and I remember you. I mean, I didn't get to watch all of it today, but I remember in the room you just being really like, "You never know what's going to happen, people."
Well, I also really wanted to normalize this. I remember asking the question, how many people have left a job when it wasn't their choice? And almost everybody raised their hand, right? Everybody has that experience. And how everybody feels when that happens is similar. Like, all the negative, I'm a loser, all those negative emotions were coming in. So I really wanted to just put it out there and say, here, I'm feeling that too. And I have no idea where this is going to take me. And that was the day one of the journey. Now, you asked me about how did it lead to Changemakers? After the processing of grief, because I was in grief at that point, I really was talking about my range of emotions, which happens at the end of every ending, right? A transition begins with an ending, and it starts with grief. You grieve the ending, whether it's a good ending or a bad ending, you're grieving a certain point in time, and you're stepping into the future in unknown territory often. And that triggers a whole bunch of emotions. So I was going through that grief process. As soon as I was able to process the grief process and get to acceptance, it's a point of time where it's a point of reflection. We can all get to an acceptance mode. And it's a point of reflection. I like to define it as your body is in a coffin above ground waiting for your soul to rise, but you have no idea when you're going to get the call. So you just have to sit there in your coffin until you get that insight where your soul rises again. And actually, there is a term for this called post-traumatic growth, where when you go through a transition and you hit that level of reflection, that is where the creativity can get fired. That's where the curiosity can get fired. That is the beginning of new possibilities.
It's crazy that you say that, because for me, I've been out on my own developing my leadership communications practice for years and years and years. I went in-house for a couple of years with two different tech companies. And when I realized this was a dead end for me and stepped out, I felt like I stepped out of that context directly into my coffin, and I laid there for a really long time because I didn't know what was next, but I knew what was over. And it was a really difficult time, especially for somebody, I share this sort of achiever disposition with you, to just intentionally, I remember this time of going, Dia, don't do anything. Don't try to do anything. Just look around, And 18 months later, the thing that popped back up was a deep and shifted recommitment to the work that I am doing now, which I'd always done but left for a while and came back to, but with sort of a renewed sense of commitment, and this crazy hobby I did for fun called auctioneering, which now I'm writing a book about. So there is something really wonderful. I think that moment of like recognizing that there's like this stillness and waiting to be called forth by the next thing and having it almost be natural. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And you actually need that time. It's almost like the universe. I always say there are no mistakes, right? This is losing my job was part of the universe's plan, right? And then you wind up in this position of reflection. And like you said, it took me a year. I was in that coffin for about a year. So, and it can kill you if you're like us who like to do, because you had to be. Instead of doing, you had to be. You had to rethink.
Totally. Literally, my meditation for that year and 6 months or whatever it was like, don't do anything, Dia. Every morning I'd wake up, don't do anything. I mean, I'd go into the garage and do pull-ups. I'd go run a couple miles. I'd pack lunches for my kids. I did the artist way, end to end. But I really, literally, don't do anything, Dia. Stop, don't do anything.
Yeah, and that's where you get that spark of creativity. I the other day I took a bath and I couldn't believe how much creativity was coming out of me, and I almost wanted to jump out of the bath to get a book to write everything down, but I'm like, wait, that's defeating the purpose. But the amount of creativity that comes out of you when you can kind of get to a place of rest and being and almost nothingness will spark that new idea. So I wanted to kind of just answer the question around the Changemaker book. So it was from that point of reflection where I started thinking about, I know I made an impact at Autodesk. I know I changed people's lives. I loved my mission there, which was to, what I believed anyway, in my story, my job was to help move that company to become much more human-centered in their thinking and in their product design. And I know I was killing it. Like I have the receipts to, as proof. I did it, right? But what did I do wrong? And this role, I was trained as a designer. I got out of art school and I became a graphic designer. But suddenly, through my career ladder, I was now at this position of this large corporation where I wasn't really responsible for shipping products. I was responsible for cultural change. And that playbook is very different than the playbook that I was trained on, not only as a designer, but as a CEO. The tool set is different when you are navigating change at any scale. And I basically felt my way through the job. And I was wondering, okay, designers for years, starting with Rise of the DEO, which the book really was sort of a call to action that future CEOs need to embrace design as a platform to lead companies. That was sort of the idea of Rise of the DEO. And now design leaders and other people who are different than business leaders and engineering leaders find themselves at these positions of power. How do they learn what to do? What are the challenges that they're facing? How are they impacting change at scale? So I got curious and I got creative and I said, this is a book that needs to be written. And I went and I spent the last 3+ years with Christopher interviewing 40, 50 people in multiple industries to really get an honest assessment of their life experiences as change makers. And this book is a culmination of that.
When you say range, you're not kidding, because in the book, I spent some time reading it this last week. In the book, you're taking small stories from folks who are, leading Echelon Institute and folks who are, in product at Chase Bank. I mean, it's that wide of a range of contexts in which these leaders are, implementing, stewarding, leading change.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and social justice. There's a woman in the book that I interviewed named Angela Lang. She is the executive director of BLOC, Black Leaders Organizing for Communities in Wisconsin. So her job is to activate the African American community to get them out to the polls to vote, right? And I mean, talk about a change maker, but talk about the challenge, right? I mean, every 2 years is an election cycle, and there are clear winners and losers. And sometimes you're on the winning side, and sometimes you're on the losing side. And when you develop your heart and you throw your heart into a campaign and somehow come up short, how do you recover from that?
Yeah, and say, no, in 2 years from now or in a year from now to start mobilizing community again, even after difficulty like that. So I love that. And speaking of practical sort of scenarios, your book is full of, it's not just sort of high level platform stuff. You give some really pragmatic to-dos in there that aren't fill in the blanks, but they are approaches to designing change. And one of the frameworks that you offer in there is called the double diamond.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about what the double diamond is and how leaders might use it when they're either designing change or moving through it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, designers love their design models. Everybody loves a good process model. So you asking me about the double diamond is actually a very controversial question, because you're going to get people who are like, oh, yes, I know the double diamond. I understand it. I followed it. And you're going to get people like, that's an old, outdated model. And, and it's not realistic anymore. The double diamond model, I can't remember what year it came out. But it's a process that was, 2005, came out by the British Design Council in 2005. So it was an attempt to describe a process around design. And so it looks like you said, it looks like a double diamond, but really it's about divergent, convergent thinking. So when you're a designer.
So let me just jump in here and say, for folks who are listening, when we say double diamond, they're like two diamonds laying on their side with the pointy ends of each one touching one another.
Yes.
So you can imagine there's like a diamond to your left and a diamond to the right, and then the pointiest parts are touching each other. So it looks like almost just like the frames of glasses, but in a diamond shape, correct?
Yeah.
So you can imagine if you go from left to right, you can imagine it starts at two points that are converging and then gets wide to the widest part of the diamond and then converges again and then attaches to the next diamond where it widens and then converges again at the end. So just for people to have a mental model of what it looks like.
Very nice. Yeah. And basically it really is on one pointy end, it talks about identifying a problem and then going divergent in your thinking rather than problem solution. What are all the possibilities based on that problem that need to be explored, right?
And that's the widest part of that first diamond, right? That's where it opens up to.
Yeah, it's the widest part. And, often people call that the discover phase, which is discovering and doing research about all the possibilities that are around this problem. And then after you collect the research, you start looking for patterns. You start looking for things and grouping them into themes and patterns. And that's called the define phase, where you come up with a hypothesis or a vision or, something that needs to be proven out.
And this brings us to the middle part, right, where these two diamonds are touching each other. So we've expanded and now we've created focus around something, correct? Okay.
Right. So you're focusing on a solution, and then you are going into the next diamond where you're developing that solution out. You're coming up with a hypothesis and you're designing and developing a solution. So you're going divergent once again. And then you get to your designed solution, and then you deliver it, which you produce it, which gets you to a convergent solution to the end of the diamond, which is the solution. So that has been a model that designers have used a lot, but that model has changed over time. There are, there's agile models that are different. There's lean models that are different. And I like to modify that a little bit because there is no such thing as a solution, a problem and solution, right? In today's world, our solutions are way too complicated. So instead of it being a double diamond, it's more like an infinity loop. You're constantly in a fluid system where you're discovering and thinking of a solution and defining it and then developing it and learning and testing and then delivering it and learning and testing and going right back to discovery. So it is more of an infinity loop. And that's really true for change because there is no ending for change. I always say you can't one of the biggest mistakes is thinking, oh, I'm going to change that, and that there's an ending to change.
Oh, it's so unsatisfying to not have
I know.
I mean, this is an incredibly brave thing for a leader to, be on the scene, so to speak, whether they're, newly arrived or someone who's been there, to recognize that something is deserving of change or that there is a change that is needed, recognizing that it is never done.
It is never done, and it's never linear. You don't go forward. You go back a lot. And sometimes you go into a tailspin, right? So it's not like a finite model. And what I like to reframe about change making is the measure of success is progress, because typically change makers don't last in their jobs very long, And so it takes a certain amount of courage and audacity to be a change maker, because there's so much failure involved in change making.
When did you know you were a change maker?
Yeah, well, I think that when I was in that coffin, and I was curious about reflecting on my life, and the things that really get me up in the morning, even though I've accomplished a lot and I've shipped a lot of products in my design life, and I love a good, beautifully designed product. It wasn't the thing that really gets me up in the morning. The thing that gets me up in the morning is having impact on people's lives and changing their lives for the better. And I got incredible joy as a leader of a design studio with hiring people and getting them to believe in a mission or a project or something in collaboration to achieve something greater than they could ever imagine if they did it on their own. And it gives me incredible pleasure when I feel like I've had an impact on people's lives. And that's really what has sustained me. And by definition, that's being a change maker.
So I maybe that's an invitation for folks who are listening to consider the question for yourself, whether you're in a coffin or not. Do you self-identify as a change maker? Is that a I don't know if it's a mantle, or is that a cape you want to wear? It's a really provocative and wonderful question, because there's something so powerful around naming and claiming things. And in that vein, I want to talk about naming and claiming. One of the things you talk about in the book, which I think is tied to what you talked about a moment ago around the measure in change can't be completion, it has to be progress, right? And the ways in which we can eke toward progress. You talk a lot in the book about, the power of naming in communicating around the change that you're trying to cause, to title your initiative something, to give the project, a name and an identity so that people can maybe attach or what. Can you talk a little bit about the power of naming and using language as you go out and champion the work of the change that's trying to occur?
Yeah. Because the thing about change, especially because it's not necessarily, it may be tangible. You might be getting somebody to actually make something or deliver something that's really tangible. But the process of change is intangible and it's abstract. So naming it allows people to put some kind of mental model around the thing that you are trying to achieve. Because then you can talk about it in concrete terms and you could define the progress that you're making along the way. So moving people along the process and understanding, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's why it's important to people's lives, and here's what it's called, and here's what we learned. And so that people now can start using that, building that mental model around naming an initiative and understanding it in the context of where you are in the process.
That is such a useful tool. I think, I work with a lot of VC-backed founders, senior level leaders, and they are talking to me a lot about how to create change or how to, move things down the block, right? And there are some things that they don't recognize as initiatives that actually can have a lot more energy around them if they can answer the question, what do you call that? And oftentimes there's an opportunity to name something that helps bring it into an actual concrete thing, as you said. This is a missed opportunity very often in the world of change and leadership communication around what needs changing. You can name the heck out of things. You can talk about 5 different topics in a very squishy way, but the moment you name each of them, now all of a sudden they're pillars in an overall strategy, you know?
Absolutely. And actually the story that you're referring to in the Changemaker book is by Phil Gilbert, who was a very senior leader at IBM, which is one of, I think, the largest company in the world. So by naming an initiative, that could be communicated across a company of 500,000 people. And people understand when they hear the term hallmark, they're going to know what that program is because it has an identity and it has definition. And so it's super important to communicate, especially when you're at large numbers of scale where people need to kind of drop in to something.
Once it has a name, it has a definition, and you can start to figure. And in defining the thing that you've just named, I think you help create clarity for yourself as the leader and communicator, and even a set of sort of nomenclature that helps describe what is inside the initiative and what is outside of it. You start to put some boundary around it that creates clarity for you as the one leading the initiative, and I think also for those that are trying to understand it so they know what's in and what's out. When you signal that word, like the term hallmark in the example in the book, we know what it is and we know what it isn't.
Well, it also creates identity, in some ways, not only for the initiative, but for the people who are supporting it. So it's clarity, absolutely, but it's a great opportunity to, it's like any mark making. All right, I'm stepping out, I'm being the designer now. It's like creating a brand identity, right? When you create a brand identity, you're doing the same thing. What are our values? What are our principles? What do we hope to achieve? How is this name associated to the values and the things we're hoping to achieve, and how can people get behind it? It's taking brand identity and applying it to a process instead of a product.
So a lot of leaders I work with, no shade everyone, but fail to sort of realize the power of a campaign around leading change. Can you talk about maybe, the work that you did at Autodesk or other really critical change initiatives that you took on, and what kinds of campaign activities you participated in and led in order to instigate and accelerate the change you were looking to create?
I can't underscore how important communication is for any change initiative. It will make or break any change initiative if you don't have a clear communication strategy on how you're communicating the change. And again, it's, what is it? Why is it important? Who's it benefiting? How are you delivering it? What are the dates? All of that is part of a communication plan that has to be wrapped up. So it's like, okay, so we have this change initiative, and how best to communicate this to the audiences that we want to reach. So who are the audiences? And then how should that information be delivered, right? Especially if you're dealing with cultural audiences. Some people communicate everything on Slack. That can be the culture of the organization. Some people are like traditional organizations are buried in email, right? Sometimes it's best to go somewhere and do a face-to-face roadshow and see people and look at them in their eyes, right? So you have to think about, okay, here's the change initiative, and then how do we build support? Because that's another big part of change making. Is the goal is to build support for what you're trying to accomplish, because change is personal, it's emotional. There's a lot of fear in change. It creates a lot of uncertainty. Some people love change. It's like they jump in. Those people who are like, oh, fire, I'm going to jump right into the fire. And some people are like, no way, keep me away from that as far away as possible. I am like going to stay firmly rooted where I am. And then you got these people in the middle, which I call bridge builders, who are on the fence. They're neutral and they just need more evidence before they can, support. So while you're doing this change initiative, the goal is to build more supporters, right? Minimize the detractors and build supporters. So what do they need to know in order to get behind what you're doing? And then how do you deliver it? How do you deliver it, and to what frequency is needed in order for that to be communicated?
And to me, it's really easy for communication to just think about, I've deployed the information into the system.
Yeah.
And that's good. That's enough.
And nobody will read it.
Totally. So this is why I use this word campaign, because it has, and I love that you're pointing to the purpose of the communication is a lot about generating support. And how you do that is to deploy the information, generate understanding, help people integrate it. Like, there's a lot of things you can do. How you do that in all those channels is another question. But to approach these more as a campaign and less as just a transaction of information into the system.
Yes, it's a classic mistake people make, right? Because some people are really afraid to communicate, or it's not their strong suit. And then I tell them, find somebody who's good at it then. Partner. You're not going to be great at everything. A big part of change initiatives is building a team of collaborators who play to their own strengths, right? And so if you are one of those people who, is strong in one area, maybe it's in building a prototype or having a hypothesis or, coming up with a great idea, but maybe English is your second language, or you're introverted, or whatever it is, it's still important to be your authentic self. But that does not excuse the fact that communication has to happen. So figure out how to get it done with the people who can support you to make sure that the strategy is going to be executed. And it's a big classic mistake that people don't communicate progress. The other classic mistake is they don't share failure, in a campaign, right? If you are doing a campaign and all you're showing is good news, that might not build trust, because everybody knows that there's no such thing as good news only, right? So the important thing about communication is really sharing your progress and also identifying the challenges that you're facing along the way, and perhaps strategies to deal with the challenges you're facing. Like, the invitation is to be open and transparent.
There is something so powerful about that. And, my indoctrination into the open source community when I got to do a bunch of work with Mozilla was a wonderful opportunity. I had grown up in communications around these sort of ta-da moments, right? And it was actually very counterculture to bring ta-da to the table in in a system that valued, that operated in open source values. And it was just such a wonderful thing to be able to bring some ideas to the table, to, name your initiative, to be able to see and share wins, but also build in the open in such a way that it invites more people in to help solve problems that you're willing to share about and collaborate on, which in fact did the exact thing you were naming a moment ago, which is around building support, enrolling people, because now they're participating, not just consuming.
Right. And, and recognizing that change is really hard for people. Like, another classic mistake that people make when they're change makers, they get hired in an organization to do X, Y, and Z, and they are super fired up, and they go in, again, running into the burning building, and they don't realize they're stepping over bodies along the way, right? And those bodies are still breathing, right? And so recognizing that there were things that were done before you showed up that need to be recognized. There were people who had tried and failed that still might be in the company and organization that you need to tap into as a source of wisdom and knowledge, right? And you need to recognize how to bring people over the edge to go from fear to hope. And so it's super important to not only be empathetic, but compassionate. that not everyone is going to share in your enthusiasm, and to recognize that people are different, and to have a little humility and understand that people may need certain things in order for them to become supporters.
Beautiful.
It's not one size fits all.
That's really beautiful, and a good reality check to think about sort of what you're actually dealing with, even though you might be very future focused and, as you said, enthusiastic about the vision of what's possible, to bring along and recognize the context that you're operating in, and that you're not the only one in the room. So along that sort of same theme of recognizing how difficult and bumpy and complex some of this change can be, imagining that you've identified your problem and you've engaged in the double diamond process, and you're now deploying a solution, recognizing that progress is sort of your measurement, but that you are knowing what you're moving toward, and that it's a really long haul. And for some of us, wink, wink, who have a hard time with the super long haul, and even changemakers who are saying yes to long haul projects, it is hard and can feel like it's moving at a glacial pace, with key moments here and there, but there's an exercise of sort of delayed gratification here on the path to this kind of change you're trying to create. How do we deal with that, and how do we hold on to hope in the face of that?
Yeah, well, I have a lot of experience, working in tech, and I know that people in tech are famously impatient, right? So. And they have this fear that if I don't ship this, it's not real, right? Or I have to ship. I know it's not great. It might not solve all the things for these. I know there's a lot of tech debt. Maybe the product is really hard to use, but I'm going to get it out there, and we're going to learn, and we're going to iterate. Now, there's nothing wrong with putting something out there and learning and iterating. The problem is rushing things out that you really know that there's going to be more damage than good to ship something. So there's a story in this book around my boss at Autodesk. He was like the chief product officer at Autodesk. He was my boss, named Amar Hans-Paul. He talked about pushing out this product. He was so impatient. He's like, I got to get this thing out. And this is classic. Leaders give you a ship date with no logic, right? They just pull a date out of the air, creating a forcing function for everybody to rally around that date, damn the torpedoes, and get something out on that date. And the date is more important than the quality of the work or the benefit to the customer. So people are really impatient. A lot of leaders, especially in tech, drive people to a date. And rather than forcing people to a date, what I would say is, and this is more of an agile-based logic, is, let's continue to build a prototype. Let's pull something out that's small. Maybe we're not shipping it. Maybe we're sharing it with a few people to learn and iterate. But put something out that is more of a test balloon than it is the thing. So how do you build progress and put that anxiety or that impatience aside and still feel good about where you are, but doing it in a more intentional manner?
So I hear there's you can kind of keep hope alive by finding small, less risky and meaningful steps along the way to the big shebang. This idea that you can harvest tiny shipping in between the big shipping so that we can satisfy that need to see progress without actually sinking the ship.
You said it so much better than me. Yes. You should write a book. Oh, that's right. You are writing a book. But that's exactly right. Is what is success and what's reasonable, and how do I demonstrate progress by smaller milestones rather than the big milestone thinking it's the end, because like I said, there's no such thing as the end.
Yes. So here's our last question for the day, which is when I ask you in one or two sentences, how would you answer this? For you, what does it mean to lead with who you are?
Ooh, my whole life I have been my authentic self. So leading with who I am is really about leaning into my authentic self and being confident with how I show up in the world with honesty, integrity, and authenticity, and leaning into that and stepping into it hard, and knowing that when you lead from your authentic self, you are at the greatest. You're the greatest point of greatness for you. And I grew up. I'm a girl who grew up in Staten Island, New York, with that big hair. The big hair from the '80s. And when I graduated, I did not look like a typical designer of the day, which was more of a white male who wore black and had no emotion. I had a loud voice. I cursed up a storm. I looked like Melanie Griffith from Working Girl. And rather than hiding behind that, I doubled down on it. And I doubled down on my persona my whole life, bucking the odds that I was not like a traditional designer. And I wound up coming out on top. And that is because I don't have anything to hide behind, because I've always led from a place of authenticity and integrity.
See what I said, everybody? Punk rock. So if you have a chance to see Maria speak at an upcoming business or design conference, I will highly encourage you to do that. You can, of course, always find her on the interwebs. Where might they find you on the interwebs, Maria?
Well, if you're interested in our book, we have a website called Changemakersbydesign.com. And if you are interested in coaching, you could reach out to me at hotstudio.com.
Loved having you, Maria, as usual. And I'm always going to be seeing you around the bend.
I'm so happy that you've been part of this new journey for me. And you are a badass in your own right. And I just am all fired up and honored to be on your show.
Thanks so much. Lead with Who You Are is a production of Dia Bondi Communications, scored, mixed, and produced by Arthur Leon Adams III, and executive produced by Mandy Miranda. You can reach out to us at hello@diabondi.com or leave us a voicemail at 341-333-2997. You can like, rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Go to diabondi.com for show notes and to learn about all it is that we do to help you speak powerfully and lead with who you are.